Torna Fem Ciència, una sèrie fonamental per repensar el feminisme, la història i la cultura científica. Aquesta temporada tindrà 2 blocs, cultura material i formes de comunicar la història de la ciència. Cadascun estarà format per 4 entrevistes i una taula rodona on conversarem amb totes les entrevistades. Avui parlarem amb Gaye Danişan, professora i investigadora al Departament d'Història de la Ciència de la Universitat d'Istanbul. Els seus temes d'investigació es centren en la història de l'astronomia otomana entre els segles XIV i XVIII, especialment els instruments astronòmics portàtils i de navegació i també els calendaris i bolmes. Destacar que està organitzant, juntament amb Florence Somer, de l'Institut Français d'Études Anatoliennes, un congrés internacional sobre la transmissió del coneixement astronòmic en el context cultural otomà. La història de la ciència i la tecnologia és sexista?
I wish I could say no, but history tells us the story of women in science. It is full of anecdotes about women's roles, tasks, capacities, and many stories of women's success begin with the precise despite. However, discussion on gender and science has become an important field almost within the last 10 years, and I hope it will improve with more conceptual
Com
approaches.
s'hauria de commemorar la ciència? Què n'opines del Dia Internacional de la Dona i la Nena a la Ciència?
I think we like to focus on powerful stories to catch people's attention on commemorative days. So heroic stories seem to be preferred. Thus, we usually see people who have achieved success being highlighted and symbolized. I think one of the reason for this is that people need a role model or motivation to keep going against the chance. That's the nature of commemorative days. Is that something wrong? No, of course not. But is it the only option? I'm not sure. I'm not very sure about that. On the other hand, advance in science do not develop among utopian people in a utopian world you have created. Economic, environment condition, education, perception, etc. It is a concept that needs to be considered as a whole with everything. According to what? According to whom? According to which culture? Which period? I can keep going to ask during the whole day. For this reason, I like to see process where failures are emphasized as much as success. In this sense, women's presence in science can raise awareness when it is celebrated with creative ideas that are more inclusive and reflect the condition of the time and cultures.
Quin rol tenia la cultura material a la cultura otomana?
First to come to mind might be some of the most popular art forms such as calligraphy, painting, poetry, textile, and carpet weaving, and of course Ottoman architecture that have some clues to define the culture of the period. However, now it is possible to discuss the material culture in the history of science with changing approaches. Science, since scholars have increasingly explored the role of the instruments and other materials in the history of science. I can give some new examples from the Ottoman astronomy files with this perspective. For example, as generally known, judging from the number of surviving instruments and manuals on astrolabes and quadrants in Ottoman literature, these instruments were by far the most commonly used for determining the time in the Ottoman territory. Thus, we can come across a lot of articles on these kinds of instruments. Ottoman calendars are also another valuable sources for obtaining information on portable astronomical instruments. For instance, cross staff is mentioned in the term palastrilia in an anonymous Ottoman calendar, perpetual calendar, which was prepared for the latitude of Algeria from the 18th century. Moreover, it is possible to encounter vowels in the Ottoman calendars. About 6 years ago, asking a question about the paper instruments in Ottoman literature was not usual. When I encounter an automobile in the perpetual calendar, my adventure started. And however, determining the role of paper instruments in the history of science contains many difficulties, since the importance of using paper instruments during the Ottoman literature remains unexplained. Firstly, we need to find a true methodology to use, and because of most of research on paper instruments has been studied for European examples and identified their features. But European and Ottoman paper instruments had two different styles for the context and technical production.
Quins elements determinen la diversitat d'instruments astronòmics a l'Imperi Otomà?
I think this is another remarkable subject related to applied astronomy in Ottoman culture. It seems that main factor was timekeeping. If we ask why Ottoman scholars usually prefer to use astrolabe and quadrants, because we know that they were used by Ottoman muwakkids as a main portable astronomical instruments. Besides this, we have clues that these instruments were used for training for Ottoman students in madrasa. It might be another reason. On the other hand, the diversity of astronomical instruments was related to operation that could be performed with them. Thus, some Ottoman scholars wrote about the celestial globe and equatorial circle, etc. For example, Ottoman navigator Seydi Ali Reis described 5 portable astronomical instruments in his treatise entitled Mirati Kainat for purposes of ilmi nujum. It means science of the stars. And he also did point out different requirements of navigators, astronomers or astrologers, and timekeepers while he was describing the equatorial ring.
Quina informació ens aporta la cultura material pel que fa a la transmissió i l'intercanvi de coneixements entre societats?
I think that studies on this subject are quite difficult, but also important as they require a multi-dimensional perspective. Especially the studies conducted in this direction are quite new approaches in terms of the history of Ottoman science. In this respect, our knowledge is still in intel stage. I can explain this again with an example from Seydi Ali Reis. Seydi Ali Reis described a celestial globe in Mirat Kainat. When we focus on his description, we can say that this globe represents Islamic tradition. However, then I compared other copies of Mirat Kainat, and in a 17th century copy, I found a figure of a celestial globe which the copies had added. The instrument depicted on this copy has 2 additional pieces, which are described neither in this copy or in other copies. One of these pieces is probably a plumb line, and the other is an hour circle attached to the North Pole. And the hour circle on the celestial globe probably represents a European tradition than Islamic tradition, and in the case possible European influences.
Quina era la relació entre les persones que elaboraven els calendaris i les que els utilitzaven?
Calendars are built around a core based on astronomy and mathematics with functional content suitable for many different segments of the social cultural context. And Ottoman scholars constructed the formal structure of these calendars according to the relationship they established between the microcosmos and macrocosmos, and the content of the calendar according to the analogy they established based on this relationship. On the other hand, they prepared their calendars, which also contain elements reflecting the identity of Ottoman society, tend to place temporary resources in a framework that is the same for everyone with the calendar tables it contains. Thus, Ottoman calendars are extremely valuable source in the history of Ottoman scientific researchers, since they contain information on broad areas, including astronomy, astrology, meteorology, natural science, health, nutrition, religious beliefs, and philosophy. Our question why the information contained in the calendars was in such a broad spectrum, and how was the relationship between the person preparing in calendars and calendar users are related to the examination of the practical aspects of calendars. Our findings show that official Ottoman calendar makers, whom we know as chief astronomer, Müneccinbaşı, prepared their calendars as a political and diplomatic tools. Thus, we can find information related to agriculture, meteorology, maritime, the bridge with the process of transition to financial issues such as taxes or seafaring missions. Thus, at least we can say that Ottoman sailors and head of the financial department should have used these calendars except Ottoman sultans.
Podem trobar dones relacionades amb instruments astronòmics o de navegació en el context otomà?
For the Ottoman case, at least for now and for early periods, we can't say yes. However, this is a difficult question to answer for various reasons. For example, suppose we address the question of the actors who contributed to Ottoman science with new approach to the history of science. How can we evaluate the contribution of artisans? Because what we know about instrument makers in the history of Ottoman science is still quite limited. It belongs to Süreyya Faraki, one of the historians who has contributed important studies on artisans in the Ottoman territory. And she emphasized the lack of information in these files in her works. However, when we do a quick catalog search within the scope of a question about the scholars who contributed to literature on the history of Ottoman science, we can easily see there was a male-dominated environment in scholarly or scientific studies. Of course, it is possible to draw some conclusion from this. On the other hand, can different conclusions be drawn when considered in parallel with the increased study in studies on the role of women in Ottoman society and the emergence of new methodological approach in the history of science. Why not? Many studies in this direction have deal with urban women's social and legal status in the 19th and 20th centuries, their educational studies, and their place in working life. These studies have mostly sought to identify how women's legal and social position changed due to social advances and some innovates supporting women. It can also be said that some innovation were tried to be introduced in the field of education. On the other hand, again, this trend needs to be addressed more deeply concerning the history of science.
Sí, secular, Gaye. Aquest ha estat el primer episodi de la tercera temporada de Fem Ciència. No us perdeu els següents. Fins aviat!